Hello, my name is Gustavo Pacheco, and I'm an instructor for the MBC STEM Academy. Um, this video is a part of the series of lectures on biology, and I'm a student at the University of Chicago. If for any further questions, my email is gpacheco@uchicago.edu. Today, the topic that we'll be discussing uh, is cells. This will be part of the two lecture series, and today's specific lecture is on structure and function of the cell. So let's go over some basics of the cell. So what is a cell? It is the basic functional unit of all living things. It has a plasma membrane, which binds the cell and encloses the nucleus and the cytoplasm. So the cytoplasm, it consists of organelles that are suspended in the cytosol. And organelles, they're basically just specialized bodies inside of the cell. They carry out specific functions. The cytosol, it's a fluid matrix consisting of water and dissolved substances such as proteins and nutrients. It's important that you keep in mind that it does contain water, because this is important for the way that the plasma membrane functions. So let's have a better idea of how a cell looks. This is a general diagram of how a cell would look. So here, this is the whole entire cell. This specific arrow is pointing to this outer layer, which is the plasma membrane. These dots here and circle are organelles, and all this fluid here is the cytosol. And I am drawing a bracket around kind of all this area in here to show that this is the cytoplasm. So everything inside is the cytoplasm, and the cytosol is just the fluid. The cytoplasm includes the organelles. Okay? So let's discuss a little bit about what the plasma membrane is and what it does. So it separates internal metabolic events from the external environment. So you want to keep what's going on inside from inside and not to extend outside. So it controls the movement of materials into and out of the cell, but it allows for things to pass into the cell and pass out at the same time, while making sure that basically chemical reactions inside the cell are being contained inside the cell. So the lipid bilayer, it's a double phospholipid membrane. So what that looks like is that it looks something like this diagram on the side. So there are polar hydrophilic heads that form the two outer faces. So here are the polar heads, these circles. And there's non-polar hydrophobic tails. So these are these tails right here that point towards the inside of the membrane. So this is the inside, outside of the membrane, and on the outside and over here bordering the two polar heads, you have water. So since these are hydrophilic, these can be in contact with water, and so generally this will be the outside of the cell, and this will be the cytosol. So that's something important to keep in mind. So let's continue. Now we will talk about another component of the plasma membrane, which are the proteins that are throughout the flexible membrane. So there are peripheral proteins. These are attached loosely to the inner or outer surface of the membrane. And then there are integral proteins that extend into the membrane. These are amphipathic. And so basically what that means is that the hydrophobic parts try to stay inside of the membrane, and the hydrophilic parts try to stay outside of the membrane. So it kind of looks something along these lines. So here you have your plasma membrane with the polar heads, non-polar tails. And here are some peripheral proteins here. And then you have these integral proteins, and this kind of bump outside would be something that would be hydrophilic, and then this that extends inside would be something that would be hydrophobic. And so all of this together makes up the fluid mosaic model of the of the plasma membrane. And so what that means is that you have a bunch of proteins that are scattered throughout the flexible matrix. So that's kind of goes on what you that kind of fits with the word mosaic, and so it's very flexible. And so yes. So now that we have gone over a couple of the basics of the plasma membrane, I would like to go into some more depth about some of the features. So as we've already mentioned, there is a phospholipid membrane. It's selectively permeable. So what this means is that it only allows small uncharged polar molecules and hydrophobic molecules to pass across the membrane. So conversely, large polar molecules and ions can't pass through easily. So there are some proteins in the plasma membrane. There are many types, but the first type that we'll discuss are channel proteins. So these are open passageways through the membrane that allow hydrophilic substances to get through. There are also ion channels, and these allow for ions to get across the membrane. A specific type of ion channel is called a gated channel, and so these are ion channels that are in nerve and muscle cells that open and close to in response to chemical or electrical stimuli, and these allow the passage of potassium and sodium ions. So these allow for as we've seen, kind of muscle contraction and action potentials across neurons. So another type of protein is called a porin, and so these allow the passage of certain ions and small polar molecules through membranes. One specific kind is an aquaporin, and so this one exists in specific types of cells that increase the passage rate of water. These are in cells that it's very important for them to have water inside and out, enter the cell quickly and get out of the cell very quickly as well. And so these are generally in kidney cells and plant roots. Another type is carrier proteins. These bind to specific molecules, and then they're transferred across the membrane after the carrier protein changes in shape. And so actually glucose uses a carrier protein to get across the membrane. Another kind of protein is the transport protein, and this uses energy in the form of ATP. That's the cellular currency of energy, and which is adenosine triphosphate. And so this allows us to transport materials across the membrane. So one type of transport that transport proteins use is active transport. And so what this means is that you have to use energy to transport materials. And so one example of this is the potassium sodium pump. And so you use ATP to try to maintain a higher concentration of sodium and potassium on opposite sides of the plasma membrane. So this kind of goes against the gradient, but you're having to use energy to maintain this difference in concentration. Another type of protein that we have is called a recognition protein. And so this gives each cell type a specific ID. And so these are called glycoproteins because they have short polysaccharide chains that are called oligosaccharides, and they're attached so that they extend away from the membrane surface. Another kind of protein is adhesion proteins. These attach cells to neighboring cells or provide anchors for the internal filaments and tubules that give stability to the cell. Another kind of protein is a receptor protein, and so these allow binding sites for hormones or other trigger molecules so that specific cell responses are activated. And so the last two components that I'd like to discuss of the plasma membrane is cholesterol. And so these are molecules that are distributed throughout the phospholipid bilayer, and they provide some rigidity to the plasma membrane of animal cells. However, in plant cells, they have sterols instead. So not cholesterols, but sterols in plant cells. And so finally, glycoalix. This is a carbohydrate coat. It covers the cell wall of some bacteria and the outer face of plasma membrane of some animal cells. And so these are made up of oligosaccharides that are attached to glycolipids, or membrane phospholipids, and glycoproteins, which are membrane proteins. So glyco, as you probably can guess, the prefix glyco means membrane. And their function is to provide adhesion, barrier to infection, and markers for cell-to-cell recognition. Now, I have here a drawing of a plasma membrane, and I have drawn arrows to specific parts of the plasma membrane, and I would like for you to pause the video here and try to identify each part. So pause the video now. Okay, so now that you've had a chance to identify the different pieces, here are the answers. And we will continue our next lecture on the cell and organelles.